What's going on, and welcome to On Map, On Mission. My name is Matt, and thrilled to be with you today. We're going to start 2 episodes today on one massive topic: money, 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 money. So buckle up. It's going to be a great conversation. Got my friend Christian here, and here we go. So Christian Miller.
What's up?
What's going on, man? We're welcoming you to the On Map, On Mission podcast. Is this your first time to sit up here and be a part of this?
I've been waiting for you guys to invite me up here, and you're
the most talented thing we've got, and we're just not utilizing you to your fullest potential.
Thank you. At least you recognize that.
I do recognize that. Hey, we are talking about money, and it's this 2-episode podcast about common sense, and a little play on words there, but this is not so common. I think we're created uniquely. God's given us all this different hardwiring, and yet this idea of being generous to one another, being generous before God, I think it sometimes escapes us in the way that we live out our faith. And so we just wanted to have a conversation around that. Before we get to it though, tell our audience today who's listening or who's watching, you've served in like 4,000 different capacities.
45 different roles in this church.
Yeah, but what are you doing currently? You are a part of our executive team, but just tell those listening what you do currently.
Yeah, so I kind of wear 2 hats. One is I oversee our adult ministries. So that's everything from our small groups, our senior adults, men's, women's culture. That's been really fun to kind of dive into ministry there. And then a very distinct and other hat is that I have the privilege of overseeing the finances of our church.
I sense a bit of sarcasm in your tone. When you say I have the privilege, that's not exactly what you expected when you signed up to be in ministry, huh?
Yeah, so 2 years, a friend of mine came up and said, "Hey, I've got a need. I need you to take over the finances of this church." And it just so happened to be my boss. So I felt kind of obligated.
I feel like you're looking through me right now.
Step into that.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, it was obviously nothing that I thought that I was going to be doing in ministry, but kind of one of those aspects of generosity is like, are you being open-handed, and are you allowing God to lead and direct? And so it was a little scary to step into that, especially that, I don't have a finance degree. I haven't worked at a bank. I don't, I have my own personal finances and feel like I'm a good steward. But the fact that you had some faith in me and you said, "Hey man, I need you to step into this because I trust you." And it's been a wild ride for 2 years.
Yeah, and it's not exactly just been a couple of normal years. I mean, we've had a lot of things happen. We don't need to get into all of that, but I love what you said. You said generosity, a big part of generosity is just living with an open-handed posture. And I think so often when people hear generosity, it's really about money, and everybody complains if people in church talk about money. The irony of that is that Jesus talked about it as much as he talked about anything else.
Right. Yep.
I think the statistic is that he talked about it more than he talked about heaven and hell combined.
Crazy.
And it's because our heart is so inextricably linked to this idea of security.
That's exactly right.
And we find our security in places other than in our identity in Jesus, right? And so we end up struggling with the concept of generosity or giving, or why would God ask me to give 1/10 of my... it just gets all crazy. And yet there's something that he's put in each and every one of us. And we say here at the Met that it's not actually generosity is not a financial thing at all. It's actually a discipleship issue because it locates your heart. Yep. It tells the Lord where you are, where your faith really is, if you trust him at that level. And so I love that you do, and I've seen this in you. We've been friends for more than a decade. Yeah. I've seen you live your life with open hands, and it's you serve people so well. And now, you're in this new role, and God's been kind of cultivating some of this stuff in you. Now, let's be honest, okay? Friend to friend. Yeah. We've also had some knockdown dragouts about this too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do you think that the tension is in maybe not you versus me, but maybe in one mindset versus another?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You bring up a good point. Everybody deals with money, right? And yet it is a weird topic for a lot of people to talk about and how it affects our faith. And so I've learned through this role over the last couple of years of how integral your view of money and your view of generosity affects and is intertwined with your faith. It's one thing to say, I'm going to give but the heart behind how you give is what matters, right? And I think it's interesting when Jesus talks about giving. He never says, here are the rules. If you follow this, then you're being obedient in generosity. There's a reason why he always attaches it to the heart, right? He always does. Because in a crass way, generosity is actually one of the things and one of the only ways you can almost quantify your faith by looking at your checking account.
That's good.
And so, like it or not, how we spend our money, where we spend our money, it all locates us. And so, yeah, I've learned through the last couple years, because the church's finances, God's economy, is not building bigger storehouses. That's not God's economy. God's economy is put into practice, put into use the provisions that I've given you. Steward it well, right? There's a balance between good stewardship and faith-filled generosity. And I think for us as believers in Jesus, to lead with faith first and not with this illusion of control, right? Because when we give, we feel like, at least I do, that I'm giving up a little bit of security and a little bit of control when I do the proverbial write the check, right? I'm giving up security. I'm giving up control of how my life is going to go in the future, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you sit in a role where you see the finances of the church in influx. You see the money come in, you see the money go out. And I just think maybe a 30-second conversation here around, when you talk about God's economy versus our economy, that doesn't just manifest itself in our personal finances, but you've also experienced it even in our corporate finances as a church.
Yeah.
You've managed these things and you've seen God do stuff that it's
unbelievable.
It's not supposed to add up. It's not supposed to. And when we're obedient to follow him,
that's right,
and steward the resources the way that his Spirit is asking us to do it, then things just, I remember us having a conversation recently. You came to me and you're like, hey, we're going to be in the red at the end of the year by, whatever the amount of dollars was. And it was significant. It was a couple $100,000.
Right.
Like it wasn't a little bit of money.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's not good.
Yeah.
And yet, there's less than a week, you came back to me, you're like, you're not going to believe this. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay.
Yeah.
And you expressed that we had moved from hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red to
being in the black.
In the black.
Yeah.
And then after that, another thing that we didn't catch, which put us even more favorably and in the black. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, and I remember you standing up before the staff. You've also stood up before our congregation. Would you mind telling our listeners just what transformed in you? There was a little thing that God was shaping in you and you gave into it. What was it?
Yeah. So through the process, right, and to your point, there's been a lot of those kind of moments where God shows himself, and we either choose to acknowledge it and choose to believe it, right, or we don't, and we blame it on circumstances. I was relying in that moment on a paper showing me what our forecast was going to be, right? And I had put faith in these numbers of like, okay, this is where we're going to end up. In that moment, when we looked at the final report, right, and the number was literally in the black, and I sat back in my chair and I thought about those moments of God's provision, even in my own, like in that moment, I thought back to when I got called into ministry, right? And my wife and I are struggling about how are we going to make this work? Because on paper, right, because ministry doesn't pay quite as much as corporate world. And so how are we going to make that work? And just stepping out in faith and watching God provide. He took me in that moment back there. Yeah. And then in that chair, when I was looking at that, I can remember God saying, are you trusting me? Are you trusting me with your whole heart? Right? Because I think a lot of ways we'll compartmentalize our trust, right? We'll trust God with some things, but when it comes to generosity, we don't quite trust to that level.
Okay.
And so when God does that, the whole view of generosity for me is looking at where God has brought us, right? So generosity, in your view of generosity, isn't just about what's happening right now, what my bank account looks like right now. It's a story of what God has done.
That's right.
To the faithful, of who he is and his faithfulness, and those mile markers of him providing over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's the first thing I think, if you're listening today, maybe just you take this away. Christian talked about the faithfulness of God. When you look at sacrificial giving and what it means to be a generous person, you've got to start with the person of God, the Trinity. You got to see how generous he's been. I mean, John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave."
Yeah.
And he didn't just give a portion, he gave it all. He gave his only son.
Yeah.
So it's a characteristic of God the Father, but then also it's a characteristic of Jesus, who, though equal to the Father, didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, made himself nothing. That's Philippians 2. So he is giving in his nature.
That's right.
And then you take that, and as Jesus comes and lives the sinless life and dies a criminal's death and conquers death and ascends to the Father, and the church is born, you see the early church model in Acts 2:44, 46. You see like all who believed were together. They were all in one place. They had all things in common. They were selling possessions. They were selling belongings. They were distributing the proceeds to everybody that had need. And so if you consider what it means for you as a follower of Jesus Christ, as one created in the image of God, generosity is something that we've been hardwired with.
Yeah.
And when we live a stingy life, and we wonder why we don't sense the Holy Spirit's guidance or provision in a certain way.
Right.
Like, man, I've never been stingy and been happy that I was that way.
Exactly.
I'm never like, I just think I need to keep this and hoard this to myself, even though I'm kind of feeling the prompting here. I'm really tired of my pastor always talking about money, the 3 ways that I can give. We all get it, okay? But it looks to me like the lights are on. It looks like all your salaries are getting paid. This is the mentality that we have, and it's because we're looking through the lens of expenses and income versus child and father
and identity.
And I think it's a huge mistake for us in our building of our theology when it comes to God. This is actually one of the foundational pieces.
Sure.
That everything that we have comes from him, that God owns it all.
That's right.
And I think that we're all made this way. We love to actually be people who give.
Yeah.
Sometimes even if we don't know it yet, you're sitting there listening, you're like, I've been prompted by that, and I think I might want to be a part of something.
You're right.
I sense that God maybe...
It's a faith opportunity, right?
Yeah.
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 And I think the heart, right? When you talk about those people that are like the lights are on, giving out of obligation doesn't please the heart of God, right? And I think about like in 2 Corinthians, when Paul's talking to the Corinthian church about giving to the church in need in Jerusalem, and he uses the Macedonian church as an example.
Okay.
Right? This is for me, this is one of the best generosity stories in the Bible.
All right.
And he says they gave out of their extreme poverty with abundant joy. Right? And when you look at the Bible and you see that God loves a cheerful giver, right? What you're doing when you're generous and faith-filled in your generosity is you're touching the heart of God. You're drawing closer to the Father. You're actually growing in your relationship with God. He's smiling on you. And when I read that, I think about like my girls, right? Like when they were little toddlers and they would do something cute for the first time, whether it was taking a step or doing whatever. And like they would see my wife and I's face light up. And they had so much joy because their daddy was proud of them. And that's what generosity does with God, right? When we give out of a faith-filled, abundant, because I love you, because of what you've done for me, how could I not give back? God smiles, and the joy on our Father's face draws us closer to him. That's what true faith-filled generosity does.
Yeah. It brings up the point, I pulled up Galatians 6 here. It says, don't be misled. You can't mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature, but those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. He's not just talking about money here, obviously. You were talking about the motivation behind giving.
Right.
And the motivation behind generosity.
I think that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, it
right?
absolutely does. Because if I'm motivated to see my Father's face light up, to use your analogy, which I think is brilliant, then it's really not about expenses and income. Mm-hmm. It's not even about what sits in front of me. It's what can I do to say thank you, to show you how much I'm blown away by what you've done for me. And when you harvest what you plant, there are those out there who actually write very large checks. And yet, even in those amounts, it still lacks generosity.
That's right, 100%.
And why do you think that is?
Because of their motivation, right? It could be that whatever we give, if it comes from our heart, if it's a sacrificial gift, no matter the amount. Like take the Macedonian church, they were in severe poverty, yet they were rich in their generosity, which means generosity has nothing to do with the amount.
Come on, man.
Nothing.
That's so important.
Right? It's all about the heart's posture. And I think we get into a trap sometimes, at least I do, around judging what I'm giving to. Like to your point, well, this place sure looks good. You got the lights on, the whatever, like we're placing a judgment on, is this worthy of me giving my money to, when we all know that it's all God's, every bit of it. Like even your ability to work, your ability to think, your ability to make money all came from God. And so I think that's why, sometimes when people write big checks, obviously a lot of them are doing it sacrificially. There's no doubt about it. But sometimes maybe it's not, they're doing it to check a box. And so, the man doesn't get to judge hearts. Only God does that.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap this up, it's a heavy conversation, and yet I think it actually has the potential to be a really forming conversation. Mm-hmm. If each and every one of us would understand the charge, Paul says it to the Corinthian church. He says, I want you, as you excel in faith and in speech and in all these things, he said, see that you also excel in the grace of giving.
Yeah.
And so, and that's really the charge. If you're sitting there listening today, and I appreciate, who you are and how you steward the resources. And I know it's a decision of all of us to steward the resources. Right. You kind of are the accountant for you and Gene kind of take care of all that stuff together. But you also get to see how God miraculously provides when there is no way.
That's right.
You get to see the generosity of people, or the lack thereof, however you want to say it. But in the end, I would encourage each and every person listening today to ask yourself the question, what would it look like for me to excel in the grace of giving? Yeah. And we're going to talk more about that in our second episode. But any last words for our friends listening today?
No, I'm glad you finally invited me to the podcast, man. Wow, this place is pretty cool. Probably never see it again, though.
Yeah, it's your last time for sure, by all means. No.